Hi, guys. Glad to be able to join you again. Today, I'd like to do a story from the Bible itself, and it's going to be from the book of Joshua. Now, you are familiar with Moses. You've been doing that in Bible class, and he would be a hard person to live up to. You know, Moses didn't live forever. He had to come up with a leader to replace him. And as you'll find out later, he will choose, at God's direction, of course, Joshua. Joshua has been kind of his aide, his helper there as he is leading God's people through the wilderness. And we find at the end of the books of Moses, the beginning of the book of Joshua, that God has come to Joshua and put him in charge of God's people. They're entering the promised land, and it's a great and exciting time, but it's also a really challenging time. Even to this day, Moses is this big, huge hero of the faith, where it would be really hard to be leader after Moses. At the beginning of the book of Joshua, God comes to the new leader and he gives them all these instructions, and the biggest thing that he tells them is over and over again, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Be strong and of great courage. I'm with you. Joshua chapter 1, he tells this new leader to feed on God's word, to regularly study what he had already been given in the books of Moses. That was the only Bible that Joshua had. So God is telling him this because he needs the strength. But that's not all that God does for Joshua as he's getting ready to go in. The story takes place over several chapters. Joshua sends spies into the promised land. He makes sure that God's people are spiritually prepared. But then at the end of chapter 5, we have a kind of a strange episode here that I'd like to share with you. You may have heard this before, or this may be a brand new story to you. I'm going to read from a paraphrase, starting with verse 13. And then this, while Joshua was there near Jericho, he looked up and saw right in front of him a man standing, holding his drawn sword. Joshua stepped up to him and said, "Whose side are you on, ours or our enemies?" Now, give Joshua some credit here, because if you see someone coming towards you out of the woods and they've got a gun out, even if it's not pointed at you, that's still kind of freaky. Joshua goes right up to him and asks, "Whose side are you on?" I would imagine that Joshua probably had some kind of weapon with him. This is a dangerous part of the world. It is a dangerous time. He is kind of a stranger in those parts, so it would be good to be prepared. And here's somebody coming up to him. This fellow responds, and imagine how this would feel if this were you hearing this for the first time. This guy, the stranger coming out of the dark, says, "Neither. I'm commander of God's army, and I've just arrived." Joshua fell face to the ground and worshipped, it says. He asked, "What orders does my master have for his servant?" And God's army commander ordered Joshua, "Take your sandals off your feet. The place you're standing is holy." Wow. There's so much going on in these last two verses of this chapter. A couple of things happen here that give us a clue as to who this stranger is. One of them is that Joshua falls to the ground and worships him. And God's people are not allowed to worship anyone but him. You're experiencing the story of the golden calf. They got in big trouble for that. It was a terrible tragedy. And then the commander of God's army says to him, "Take your sandals off your feet. The place you are standing is holy." Maybe this sounds familiar to you. If it does, it's because it's the same thing that happens at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Moses is out herding the sheep, and he sees this bush that's on fire, and the bush isn't burning up. The whole thing is just super weird. And when Moses goes closer, he hears this exact same set of instructions. Take your sandals off your feet. The place you're standing is holy. And in the course of the encounter, we find out that the person Moses has met is God himself. So this character is a divine character. It's the appearance of God. And if you want to dig down and be more precise, This is Jesus before he had the name Jesus. It's this what we call now the second person of the Trinity. When God appears to people, he takes on a human form, and that's what this character is. It doesn't say he was Jesus because, again, he didn't have that name yet. But I'm commander of God's army, he says. Now, the other thing that I think is super interesting and I really want to focus in on, Joshua asks this guy before he knows who it is, he says, whose side are you on? Ours or our enemies? And you'd expect, since Israel is God's chosen people, he's been leading them out of the wilderness and into the promised land, you would expect God to say, I am on your side. But that's not what he says. He says, I'm not on either side. I'm commander of God's army. So what do you make of that? God had his purpose that he was working through Joshua, and as the story goes on, God gives them a whole set of directions for their first attack, their first battle in this new land. But God's purposes are often so far beyond ours. So when God says, I'm not on either side, that leads us to another question, which is, am I on God's side? I think all of us do that. If we have a relationship with God, we ask him for help with our projects. But I'm encouraging myself, and I guess encouraging you, to step back from that and instead ask God what his instructions are for us. Rather than trying to get God on our side, to ask him to help us to be on his side. That's the story I got for you today. I would encourage you to read it for yourself at the end of Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. You can look at that yourself. A couple different versions might show you some different things. But keep that in mind. God comes to each of us and invites us to be on his side and to lead us where we should go.